At my annual checkup, Dr. Elaine Carter went quiet. Not the professional quiet. The wrong kind. The room felt smaller as she stared at my chart, then at me, then back at the screen like she was hoping the numbers would rearrange themselves. When she finally spoke, her voice stayed careful, measured. She told me I was permanently infertile. That I had been for years. Not recently. Not gradually. Permanently. I told her I already knew. I mentioned the surgery, the complications, the long recovery that ended one chapter of my life without ever announcing it was over. Then I told her my wife was 14 weeks pregnant. That was when she looked at me like a man standing too close to the edge of something irreversible. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften it either. She said I needed to find out whose baby it really was. Before I continue, I want to ask you something quietly and honestly. If you've ever had a moment where one sentence split your life in two, stay with me. Subscribe if this story resonates, and if you've lived through something similar, share it in the comments. Sometimes knowing we're not alone is the only thing that keeps us standing. The clinic was already awake when I arrived that morning, the way medical buildings always are. Too bright, too clean, humming with the low anxiety of people pretending this was routine. Phones rang behind the front desk. A printer chattered somewhere down the hall. A child laughed in the waiting room, sharp and sudden, then was hushed by a parent who looked exhausted. I checked in, gave my name, and sat where I always sat. Same chair, same corner. I'd been coming here for years, ever since the surgery that changed my body in ways no one ever really prepares you for. I had learned how to live with it quietly. I told myself it was a private loss, manageable, contained. Something I carried, not something that defined me. When the nurse called my name, I stood and followed her down the hall, nodding politely, answering the same questions I always answered. Wait, blood pressure. Any changes since your last visit? No, nothing new. Nothing worth mentioning. I believed that at the time. Dr. Carter came in a few minutes later. She'd been my physician for over a decade. Calm, precise. The kind of doctor who never rushed but never wasted time either. I trusted her because she didn't dramatize things. She let facts stand on their own. She sat down, tablet in her hands, eyes scanning the screen. First, everything felt normal. Then her scrolling slowed. Her posture changed, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. She stopped tapping the screen and folded her hands together. That was when the silence started. It wasn't the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone deciding how much truth to release at once. She looked at me and said my name softly, like she was grounding herself. Then she told me about my infertility. Not as a possibility, not as a concern, as a settled fact. She explained that it wasn't new, that it had been documented years ago, rechecked, confirmed after the surgical complications I already knew by heart. She reminded me of the test results, the follow-ups, the notes in my file that hadn't changed in a long time. I told her I already knew. The words came out steady. Too steady. I'd had years to practice saying them, at least to myself. She nodded, relieved, I think, that she wasn't breaking that part of the news for the first time. Then her brow furrowed again, and she glanced back at the screen. She asked why my wife had called the office the day before. The question felt oddly procedural, like a checkbox that hadn't been filled correctly. I asked what she meant. Dr. Carter explained that my wife had contacted the clinic, insisting on being present for the appointment. She had asked detailed questions about timelines, about conception windows, about prenatal referrals. She had spoken with confidence, as if the medical history in front of her didn't exist. Dr. Carter asked me why my wife seemed unaware of my condition. I told her we didn't talk about it much. That part was true. We didn't. Not because it was forbidden, but because it felt settled. Old. Something already absorbed into the shape of our marriage. We'd had conversations early on. Difficult ones. We'd mourned the idea of children together in our own way. Or at least I thought we had. Dr. Carter hesitated, then asked another question. One that landed harder than the others. She asked why my wife had confidently described a pregnancy timeline that contradicted my medical file. I felt my chest tighten. Not with grief, not yet, but with something colder. Confusion edged with embarrassment. The kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own body in a room that was supposed to be private. I told her my wife was 14 weeks pregnant. I remember the exact second the room changed. Dr. Carter didn't gasp. She didn't recoil. She simply went very still. Her eyes lifted from the tablet and locked onto mine with an intensity one hadn't seen before. She asked me to repeat myself. I did. That was when she leaned back slightly in her chair and said the sentence that didn't sound dramatic but changed everything anyway. She said that given my medical history, it was not biologically possible for me to have conceived a child. Not then. Not now. Not years ago. She said there was no ambiguity in the data. No room for interpretation. She said I needed to find out whose baby it really was. The door to the exam room was closed, but the world outside it didn't stop. I could still hear footsteps in the hallway, cart rolling past, someone laughing at something trivial. All of it continued while something in my life quietly collapsed. What made it worse wasn't emotion. It was administration. Dr. Carter explained everything calmly. She used words like documented, confirmed, medically impossible. She didn't speculate about motives or feelings. She didn't mention betrayal or trust or marriage. She spoke the language of records and results, the kind of language that doesn't care who gets hurt as long as it's accurate. I sat there feeling exposed in a place designed to protect privacy. I imagined my wife's phone call echoing through the clinic system, my name attached to a story that didn't belong to me. I imagined nurses overhearing pieces of it, staff glancing at my chart with new context, not maliciously, just professionally. Public humiliation doesn't always come with an audience. Sometimes it comes with paperwork. When the appointment ended, Dr. Carter asked if I was okay to drive. I told her I was. She printed out a summary, handed it to me without meeting my eyes, and reminded me that if I needed anything, support, referrals time, I should call. I nodded, thanked her, and walked out. The waiting room looked the same as it had when I arrived. Same chairs, same people, same hum of ordinary life. I sat for a moment, holding my jacket, aware that nothing visible had changed and yet everything had. I stood up, walked past the front desk, and stepped outside into the cold air, carrying a truth that didn't belong to me but was now entirely mine to deal with. The betrayal didn't arrive with shouting or tears. It arrived folded neatly inside folders, backed by dates, signatures, and test results that had already made their decision years ago. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, letting traffic lights dictate my direction because I didn't trust myself to choose one. My phone buzzed twice, once from my wife, once from a work email I didn't open. Everything felt strangely distant, like I'd stepped half a pace outside my own life and was watching it continue without me. Eventually, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat there, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. I needed to see it again. I took the appointment summary from my jacket pocket and unfolded it slowly. There it was, my name at the top. Diagnosis codes I recognized. Notes referencing surgeries, follow-up testing, consultations from years back. Language that had once been clinical background noise now read like a verdict. Permanent infertility. No qualifiers. No conditional phrasing. No hope tucked into the margins. I remembered the day those words first entered my life. The hospital room. The faint smell of disinfectant. The surgeon explaining complications with practiced neutrality. I remembered nodding, asking technical questions, already adjusting. I'd never been a man who needed miracles. I dealt in probabilities, plans, contingencies. I learned how to carry that loss without letting it leak into everything else. I folded the paper and stared through the windshield. My wife's story, our story, had been moving forward as if none of this existed. Baby books appearing on the coffee table. Casual references to when the baby comes. Her hand drifting to her stomach in public, protective, performative. Friends congratulating us. Strangers smiling in elevators. And underneath all of it, what she was telling the world had already collapsed under its own paperwork. Later that afternoon, I logged into the clinic's patient portal from my office. I hadn't planned to. It felt intrusive, like digging into something that should have stayed theoretical. But once I was there, I kept going. Test results from different years, different labs, different specialists. Same conclusion every time. There was no single point of failure to argue against. No outlier result to cling to. This wasn't a mystery waiting to be solved. It was a closed case. I realized then that suspicion wasn't the right word for what I felt. Suspicion implies uncertainty, a gap where doubt can live. This wasn't that. This was certainty, and certainty has a weight to it that suspicion never does. My wife's pregnancy wasn't questionable. It was impossible. That distinction mattered. It stripped away any temptation to rationalize. There were no late-night conversations with myself about rare exceptions or medical anomalies. No bargaining with statistics. No quiet hope that I might somehow be wrong. I wasn't. The betrayal was procedural. It didn't rely on emotion or interpretation. It existed independent of how I felt about my wife, independent of what I wanted to believe. It existed in ink and data, in systems that didn't care who paid the price for accuracy. I thought about the phone call she'd made to the clinic. The confidence Dr. Carter had mentioned. The way my wife had spoken as if biology were a detail to be managed rather than a boundary to be respected. That confidence disturbed me more than fear would have. Fear I could understand. Confidence suggested planning. I started reconstructing the last few months the way you reconstruct an accident after the fact. Not emotionally, but sequentially. When did she start buying maternity clothes? When did the language shift from if to when? When did she stop asking and start assuming? I realized there had never been a moment where she asked me if this made sense. She never checked the math. That night, I didn't confront her. I sat across from her at dinner, listened to her talk about names she liked, nodded at the right moments. I watched the ease with which she inhabited a future that required my silence to exist. I felt oddly calm, not numb, alert, like something in me had shifted from participation to observation. This wasn't about infidelity alone. It was about authorship. She had written me into a story where my biology, my consent, my reality were irrelevant. I was a role, not a person. Provider, not a participant. By the time I went to bed, I understood something clearly for the first time since the exam room. I didn't need to confront her to know the truth. I needed to prepare. I drove back to the house just before dusk, the sky over central Ohio flattening into that dull gray that makes everything look unfinished. The house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac outside Columbus, exactly where I'd chosen it years before. Good schools nearby, mature trees, space without spectacle. I bought it long before I remarried, long before Lauren. It had been mine in a way that felt earned, settled. That night, it didn't feel like mine at all. The driveway was full. Her car angled slightly wrong, as if it had been placed there quickly. Another vehicle I didn't recognize, already gone by the time I stepped inside. I paused at the front door, key in hand, and listened. Soft music played somewhere inside. The sound of movement, life continuing. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Fresh flowers, something citrusy and artificial layered over it. The entryway looked staged, like a photograph meant to suggest warmth rather than create it. A vase I didn't recognize sat on the console table. The framed photo of Lauren and me had been moved slightly to the left, replaced by something new. A print with pastel tones and vague optimism, the kind you hang when you're announcing a beginning. I set my keys down slowly. Inside, the living room had changed. New furniture where the old leather chairs had been. Boxes stacked neatly against one wall, each labeled in careful handwriting. Nursery, storage, donations. I hadn't agreed to any of it. I hadn't even been asked. Lauren moved through the space with an ease that unsettled me. She smiled when she saw me, the practiced smile she'd perfected over the years. She talked about her day, about errands, about a delivery that had arrived earlier than expected. She spoke as if nothing had shifted, as if the ground beneath us hadn't cracked open that morning. I listened. I nodded. I said very little. What struck me wasn't her excitement. It was her certainty. The way she inhabited a future that no longer required my participation, only my compliance. She spoke about plans as if they were facts, about timelines as if they were law, about my role as if it were fixed and unquestionable. The nursery boxes bothered me most, not because of what they represented, but because of where they were placed. My study, the room I used when I needed quiet, had been cleared. My desk moved, the bookshelf partially emptied. In its place, folded blankets, unopened boxes, a rocking chair still wrapped in plastic. She had repurposed my space without hesitation. That night, I walked through the house after she went to bed. I moved slowly, noticing details I would have dismissed weeks earlier. The way my mail had been sorted differently. The way certain documents were missing from the drawer where I kept them. The way my laptop had been moved from my desk to the corner, cord wrapped tightly, as if it were something temporary. It wasn't just the pregnancy that felt invasive. It was the quiet takeover. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my study and understood something that hadn't fully formed until then. This wasn't just deception. It was displacement. She wasn't trying to share a future with me. She was overwriting one. By nightfall, the house felt less like a marriage and more like a set. A carefully arranged environment designed to make resistance look unreasonable, to make questioning feel like cruelty, to make me seem like the obstacle to something inevitable. I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe. I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder and more clarifying. The realization that whatever came next couldn't be handled emotionally. Emotion was exactly what this situation fed on. What I was dealing with wasn't just a lie. It was a structure. And structures don't fall because someone gets upset. They fall because someone understands how they were built. I waited 2 days before calling my son. Not because I didn't want to talk to him, but because I needed to be sure of my own footing first. Panic looks for witnesses. Clarity looks for structure. I didn't want to hand him confusion disguised as concern. I wanted to hear what he saw, not what I feared. Ethan answered on the second ring. His voice sounded the same as always, steady, grounded, already carrying the quiet weight of someone who learned early how to pay attention. I hadn't raised him to be suspicious. I'd raised him to be observant. There's a difference. I didn't accuse. I didn't explain everything. I asked questions that sounded casual enough to pass as curiosity. How often he'd seen Lauren lately, what he thought about how fast things were moving, whether anything about the pregnancy announcement had struck him as odd. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to matter. Then he exhaled. He didn't react with shock. He reacted with recognition. That was the moment something in my chest loosened. Not relief exactly, but confirmation. The kind that tells you you're not inventing patterns out of loneliness or fear. He said he'd noticed things too. Not one big thing, but a series of small adjustments that didn't look like problems on their own. Lauren scheduling things without checking first. Speaking for me in conversations where I was present. Redirecting discussions when they drifted toward topics she didn't control. He reminded me how quickly she had accelerated everything after the wedding. How she'd pushed for joint accounts sooner than necessary. How she'd framed it as efficiency, not urgency. How she'd begun using phrases like, "What's best for us?" when what she meant was, "What I've already decided." He asked me when the last time was that I'd spent an afternoon with friends without her involvement. I couldn't answer immediately. That bothered me. He pointed out how my social circle had thinned quietly. Not dramatically. No fights. No ultimatums. Just subtle discouragements. Someone wasn't a good influence. Another person didn't really respect boundaries. A third asked too many questions. Over time, invitations stopped coming. Or I stopped accepting them. What I thought was love adapting, he saw as control settling in. Hearing it framed that way didn't make me defensive. It made me reflective. I started replaying moments I'd dismissed as normal marital friction. Comments that felt slightly off at the time but not worth challenging. Decisions that moved forward without my input because it seemed easier to let them. Ethan wasn't angry. That mattered. He spoke the way someone does when they've already spent time sorting their thoughts. He said he hadn't wanted to interfere, that he'd assumed I saw what he saw and had reasons for allowing it. He admitted he'd second-guessed himself because he didn't want to be the son who distrusted his father's wife without proof. Proof. That word landed with weight. Before we ended the call, he suggested I speak to someone he trusted. Not a friend. Not a family member. Professional. Someone who dealt in verification, not interpretation. He gave me a name. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. But I told him enough that he understood this wasn't about hurt feelings or jealousy. This was about reality being bent into a shape that excluded me. When I hung up, I sat alone in my car for a long time, engine off, phone still warm in my hand. The neighborhood around me was quiet. Lawns trimmed, windows lit from within. Other lives moving forward in ways that made sense to the people living them. For the first time since the appointment, I felt something like alignment. Not because things were improving, but because the picture was coming into focus. The story I'd been living in wasn't just wrong. It was incomplete by design. And now, for the first time, I wasn't alone in seeing that. That was the first crack. Not in the marriage. In the narrative. The investigator Ethan recommended didn't waste time trying to impress me. No dramatic assurances. No inflated promises. Just a quiet intake meeting in an office that felt deliberately forgettable. Neutral colors. Minimal decor. Nothing personal on the walls. The kind of place designed so nothing lingered after you left. He asked for names, dates, documents. He asked what I knew versus what I suspected. I was careful with my answers. Years in business had taught me that precision matters more than passion when the stakes are real. I gave him my medical records first. That changed the temperature of the room. Not emotionally, professionally. He read them carefully, nodded once, and said something that stayed with me. That removes ambiguity. Ambiguity is where people hide. He asked about Lauren's behavior, her timelines, her insistence, the pregnancy appointments, the paperwork she'd shared with friends and family, the ultrasound images she'd shown me once and then quickly taken back, as if they weren't meant to be studied. I hadn't realized how much I'd already been cataloging until I started answering. Within a week, the first report came back. Lauren wasn't Lauren. Not entirely. Her name had changed before. More than once. Different states. Different years. Clean enough on the surface, but not the kind of clean that comes from nothing ever happening. The kind that comes from careful pruning. Old records sealed. Addresses that looped back on themselves. Employment gaps explained too neatly. Then came the pregnancy appointments. They weren't with an obstetrician. They were with a cosmetic clinic. One that specialized in hormonal treatments, body contouring, and prenatal aesthetic preparation. A place that operated legally but creatively. No actual prenatal care. No fetal monitoring. No hospital affiliations. The ultrasound images? They came from a closed practice in another state. A facility that had shut down years earlier after a licensing dispute. The images themselves were real but generic templates used for demonstrations and training. Not linked to any patient record. Not traceable to any pregnancy. The baby wasn't leverage. It was camouflage. That realization marked the shift. Up until then, some part of me, small but persistent, had still been framing this as a personal crisis. A betrayal to be processed. A marriage unraveling in real time. Once the facts were laid out, that framing became irrelevant. This wasn't about me being deceived emotionally. It was about me being positioned administratively. My role wasn't husband. It was infrastructure, assets, credit, stability, legitimacy. I stopped confronting and started preparing. I changed nothing on the surface. That part mattered. Structures collapse fastest when they don't realize they're under examination. I played my role, listened, nodded, asked questions that sounded like concern rather than verification. Behind the scenes, I separated accounts. Quietly, legally. I reviewed titles, policies, beneficiaries. I documented everything, not to weaponize it emotionally, but to preserve sequence. Dates matter. Order matters. Lauren noticed none of it. Or if she did, she interpreted it as compliance. She became more relaxed, more expansive, talked about plans further out, bigger plans, shared them publicly. The confidence returned in full. That told me everything I needed to know. People who believe they're winning get careless. By the time the investigator delivered the full report, I was no longer surprised by anything in it. The aliases, the pattern, the timing of her arrival in my life relative to specific financial milestones. None of it felt shocking anymore. It felt explanatory. I read the report once, then again slower. Not because I needed to convince myself, but because I needed to understand exactly where the seams were. Where truth could be introduced without requiring my voice to carry it. That was the final adjustment. This wasn't going to end with a confrontation in my living room. It was going to end in daylight. The turning point didn't happen at home, and it didn't happen in private. Lauren had insisted we attend the fundraiser weeks earlier. A charity gala tied to one of the regional hospital systems. Doctors, donors, administrators, a few local politicians. The kind of event that relied on appearance more than substance, and Lauren understood appearances instinctively. She said it was important to be seen, important to present ourselves as stable, generous, established. I agreed without hesitation. By then, I understood the value of a controlled environment. Neutral ground. Witnesses who didn't know they were witnesses yet. A setting where facts, once introduced, couldn't be shouted down or reframed as emotional conflict. The venue was all glass and warm light, a renovated industrial space with exposed beams and polished concrete floors. Name cards on tables. Soft music designed not to distract from conversation. Everyone dressed carefully enough to signal importance without trying too hard. Lauren was radiant that night. Not nervous. Not defensive. She moved through the room with the ease of someone who believed the future had already been secured. People congratulated us. She accepted their words with practiced gratitude, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, a gesture she'd refined over time. I watched quietly. At our table sat 2 hospital board members, a legal advisor connected to the foundation, and a woman who oversaw donor compliance. The investigator had done his work thoroughly. He'd advised me on where truth would land cleanly, without interpretation. I hadn't arranged the seating, but I hadn't objected either. Dinner passed without incident. Speeches followed. Applause rose and fell on cue. Everything unfolded according to plan, just not Lauren's. The shift began subtly. A donor compliance officer leaned toward me and asked a clarifying question about a contribution listed under my name, one I hadn't authorized. I answered calmly, asked to see the documentation, and let the silence do its work. The legal advisor at the table recognized the pattern immediately. Questions began circulating, not loudly, but efficiently. Requests for verification, cross-referencing, nothing accusatory, just procedure. Lauren noticed then. Her posture changed first. A tightening in the shoulders. A pause that lasted half a second too long before she smiled again. She tried to redirect the conversation, to lighten it, to remind everyone why we were there. But reality doesn't respond to charm. When the ultrasound images were mentioned casually in reference to a donor outreach story, someone else noted they looked familiar. Too familiar. A template they'd seen before in a training context. That comment landed softly, but it didn't bounce. Phones came out. Messages were sent. Someone excused themselves from the table and didn't return. Lauren leaned toward me and asked, quietly, what was happening. I told her to sit still. That was the only directive I gave her all night. By the time the event coordinator approached the table with an apologetic smile, the evening had already shifted into something else. Lauren stood abruptly, saying she needed air. She reached for her coat. She didn't get far. Security didn't intervene dramatically. There was no scene, just a polite request to remain on site until some discrepancies were resolved. Her confidence finally cracked then, not into hysteria, but into calculation. She looked around for leverage and found none. The evidence surfaced without emotion. Financial trails, appointment records, licensing confirmations, identity documentation. It didn't rely on belief. It didn't require my testimony. It existed independently of me. When reality finally spoke, it didn't need my voice. Lauren tried to explain, then to deflect, then to negotiate. Each attempt grew smaller than the last. The room didn't turn against her dramatically. That would have given her something to push against. Instead, it simply withdrew its trust. That was the reversal. Not humiliation. Irrelevance. I watched her realize it in stages. The moment she understood she wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. The moment she recognized that whatever exit she'd planned no longer existed. The moment she saw me not as a partner, not as an adversary, but as something immovable. She stopped looking at me after that. By the end of the night, the fundraiser resumed its shape. People returned to their conversations. Applause happened again, slightly out of rhythm. Lauren was escorted to a quiet room to wait. I stayed where I was, finished my drink, and thanked the host. I left alone. The marriage ended quietly, the way most things do when the paperwork is already ahead of the emotions. There were no arguments left to have. No revelations waiting to be voiced. Everything that mattered had already been documented, verified, and placed into systems that didn't respond to tears or explanations. Lawyers spoke to lawyers. Notices were issued. Accounts were frozen, separated, reassigned. The process unfolded with a steadiness that felt almost merciful. Lauren never asked me why I did it the way I did. I think she understood. People who build their lives on narrative always recognize when narrative has lost its power. She moved out within 2 weeks, took what she was legally entitled to, left behind what she couldn't claim. The house returned to silence slowly, as if it needed time to remember what it had been before it became a stage. I walked through each room after she was gone, not looking for memories but confirming absences. The nursery boxes disappeared first, then the flowers, then the sense of inevitability that had pressed into every corner. The investigation didn't end with the marriage. That part surprised some people. They assumed exposure was the conclusion, that once the deception was revealed, the story would naturally close. But deception on that scale doesn't exist in isolation. It leaves trails, other names, other accounts, other structures built on the same assumptions that had nearly buried me. I wasn't involved in most of it. I didn't need to be. I provided what I had, answered what I was asked, and let the rest proceed without my supervision. I'd already learned the difference between responsibility and entanglement. What I lost, I calculated. Not emotionally, financially, temporally, structurally. Loss is easier to accept when it's measured honestly. I didn't pretend it hadn't cost me something. It had. Time. Trust. A sense of continuity I'd assumed was stable. But I also didn't exaggerate it into tragedy. I hadn't lost myself. I'd nearly lost agency. There's a difference. What I kept, I protected. I sold the house the following spring. Not because it was tainted, but because I no longer needed the reminder of how easily space can be repurposed when you stop guarding it. I downsized deliberately. Fewer rooms. Fewer distractions. A place that required intention to fill. I simplified my life the way people do after realizing complexity isn't always a sign of success. I closed accounts I didn't need. Let relationships drift that had only existed by proximity. Reconnected with a few friends I'd allowed to fade. Not apologizing excessively, just showing up again. Trust came back slowly. Not as optimism, but as discernment. I learned to listen differently. To notice when certainty arrived too quickly. To ask questions without apologizing for them. The experience didn't harden me. It sharpened me. Sometimes, usually in quiet moments, I think about that exam room. The chair I sat in. The way the light reflected off the counter. The pause before Dr. Carter spoke. One sentence delivered carefully, without drama, without intention beyond accuracy. That pause was the hinge. Before it, my life was moving forward on borrowed assumptions. After it, everything slowed just enough for me to step out of a story that wasn't mine. I'm still here because I listened. Not because I suspected. Not because I confronted. Because I respected reality when it introduced itself, even though it arrived disguised as routine. Some endings are loud. This one wasn't.